And, all right, I'm going to make sure that I am on. It looks like I'm on. Ooh, and I'm even. All right. I even have the new title. Hi, everybody. So, welcome to the fourth lecture in our Games for Education course at Kent State University for this fall, or at least I'm recording this in the fall of 2022. Who knows, viewer, when you are actually accessing this information. But today I thought we'd look at some practical needs of a project. So students in my class who are taking the full class, not just watching the lectures on YouTube, are in the point where they will be working on the, oh, you know what? Let me edit something here. Haha. There we go. Now it's right. But they are working on their papers right now and needing to do some research. And one of the things that I find is really important when you are researching transformational games is not just focusing on the game development aspects themselves, but actually focusing on the I think it's better to focus on the user and what the user's needs are, particularly the user needs in games like this. Because it's one thing if you're creating, a game that you think should be an entertaining commercial game. You should certainly focus on the user needs there. How they play, what the appropriate level of challenge and things like that are. But in the case of a transformational game, you're going even farther than that. You are creating a game that is supposed to be played by a person in need of information in some way, whether that be, explicitly education or who should be learning about somebody for empathy purposes or for advocacy purposes or something like that. So we need to focus not only on like what might be a cool game, but we need to focus on things related to who is this person? Why don't they know the thing that we want them to know already? And what resources are out there for them to master this information? So that's why it's good for us to really focus on, a few more things than one would with like a normal game design. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's get going. So a lot of this material is going to come from one of the course textbooks in this course, and that is the Transformational Framework by Sabrina Culyba of Shell Games, and published by Carnegie Mellon's ETC Press. Now, this is a free book you can download online as a PDF. You can also order a paper copy for about 20 bucks. But I think because the paper copy is printed out in black and white, and the book uses like a color-coded organization system, I think it kind of defeats the purpose of the organization system for the book. So go get your free copy, but maybe find some other way to help support the press because they're doing good stuff and open access is nice. So please support them. But topics for today include where game ideas come from. We're going to look through the transformational framework. Now, this is not like a book reading. You should read the book. This does not replace reading the book, but it is going to be one that looks at some of the concepts of the framework very broadly in such a way that I hope somebody has a sort of guided tour through it. And then our case study today is the Oregon Trail Deluxe, which is the version that I played in middle school. All right, so last week we talked about core mechanics a lot, understanding that core gameplay loop of interaction and feedback that happens again and again in a game. This week I want to talk about factors that go into defining a game, what's important, what's not important. What we want to focus on as we do transformational games, games that are made to impact the player's understanding of the world around them. So when most of us start learning or trying to talk about games in an analytical way, we think about gameplay or mechanics and story, which we'll call for the sake of this motif to just kind of create a nice uh, alliterative, dualism here, duology here of mechanics and motif. Now that's pretty good. Most games that a commercial audience plays come from one of these two directions: highly gameplay driven, like in an online competitive game, or highly story driven, like in a role playing game. I have some boxes for role playing games up on my bookshelf that's right in front of me. Um, and I'm not going to go into it, but like, there are instances in the history of like game academia where these two sides were sort of at odds with one another, and it's a more complicated topic than just how people see games. But this has been like a big thing, is this like story versus mechanic uh, thing in games. But and please take my word for it here, spending time in game development has shown me that games come up from a variety of places. When you are actually in game development, I don't think the kind of dualistic mechanics first or story first is really appropriate to talk about, games. I think there's lots of reasons people make games and lots of reasons that games are put into the world. I'm going to boop so you can see the word mission. Now, this isn't a lecture where we go over all of these. I actually took this graphic from a slideshow I do for another course where I do talk about all of them. But the idea I want you to understand that's especially relevant to the transformational games process is that, like other games, player experience is central to this type of design. Other factors such as cool game mechanics or an inspiring mission, many of these games come from ones having an inspiring mission. So it can be very easy to think, I've got an inspiring mission for my transformational game, that's good enough. Or some sort of interesting technology or unique ideas. It's easy to think about how those help in really good ways, and they do. But without a good player experience at the core of them, any of these, no matter how interesting, lose their luster once the novelty wears off. And this is going off book a little bit, but I have personally both, in a judging sense in game festivals, but also in like a workplace sense, experience situations where there is a great mission or some sort of driving force behind a game. But I mean, I've actually worked in situations where I won a contract because like both of our games had missions, but I was the one that provided the good player experience because I understand how game design works, versus somebody who may be more new to game development itself. And in those cases, the game designers win because, I know for my Kent audience, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but there's a big part of the transformational games world that thinks that, you can just kind of jump in like, oh, the games aren't the important part, the mission's the important part, but the game is like, kind of a vehicle for it. And they don't really know what makes games engaging. So they just sort of use loose interactivity. And it doesn't result in much. Maybe something that could have been a website instead. So player experience, absolutely central to this idea of creating a good transformational game. So let's take something like core mechanics and think about it in terms of pure player experience. Concentrating on how mechanics, now again, if you've taken my game prototyping course, these are going to be some repeat slides. I think I'm going to, one, show them in a new way, but also two, these are important lessons for several of our game courses, so I tend to repeat them. Concentrating on how mechanics define experience rather than arbitrary elements like computer software, which is really just how a game is presented and packaged, you start to see how the same experience can be accomplished with different mediums. So if that sentence was a little bit of word soup there. Um, Way to go, note writer from the past, Chris. Basically, it's easy to get lost in the graphics. It's easy to get lost in the technology of the game, what peripherals it uses, what platform it's on, things like that. But really, the goal is creating a good player experience. Can graphics and hardware and things like that contribute to that? Of course they can. But at the end of the day, being able to make good gameplay, good experience, good emotional responses is really the core of our job. So let's take into account, like, so here's a tabletop game I like a lot called Zombies. In this game, you have a feeling of increasingly claustrophobic and resource limited gameplay in a zombie apocalypse. Now you can have it rendered on a tabletop, or you can have it rendered in some of the prototypes that I did for a game project that I had. Unfortunately, a commercial game didn't get released, called Dead Man's Trail, but that was a game that we tried to recreate that feeling of a claustrophobic, run first, shoot only when you have to zombie experience, or zombie fiction. But that's something that we really focused on in a game like this, was that feeling of claustrophobia. And we've actually had people say, when they were playtesting Dead Man's Trail, "Hey, have you played Zombies?" It's like, aha, you figured it out. We really just wanted to remake that experience, but in a video game form. Or here, you could take a visceral 3D action game and port it in the opposite to a tabletop experience. Jonathan Ying, awesome tabletop designer, did a wonderful job recreating Doom on a tabletop, and it has a lot of the visceral, feeling and boomy kind of action that Doom 2016 did. And really trying to capture a core experience seems really abstract, but for those of us who were playing video games at the period where you saw a lot of franchises make the jump from 2D to 3D, this was something that was kind of a big deal. The franchises that did this well, like, understood what makes a Metroid game, what makes a Zelda game, what makes a Metal Gear game or a Final Fantasy game. Those were able to make that kind of leap. And, and this may be a bit earlier than what many of the students watching this video experienced, but this is an area where you can see where, defining a game as a series of experiences makes it much more modular, much more able to be carried over into jumps or changes in technology than, if your game ideas are all just based on technology or some other factor like a theme or something like that, or a theme or a mission or something like that. So putting player experience at the center is crucial to our big topic today, the Transformational Framework. So as I said before, this planning tool comes from your textbook and defines points of research to do to create a research and development plan for your projects. So keep in mind, when I say tool, it's more of like a conceptual tool. It's not like there's no Transformational Framework game engine or something like that. Such an engine would be very hard to have exist because really the ideas of transformational games are more in just the application of like existing stuff. You're still going to use Unity or Unreal or GameMaker or Godot. You're really just applying the software and towards certain types of theming, towards certain types of cause and effect relationships that create the kind of rhetorics that we talked about last week. So what this is a set of elements that you should determine about your project. I like the transformational framework a lot because it's almost like a transformational game design document for your game. So if you're familiar with the game design document, a good framework or a good template for a game design document is the one that will have you answering questions you never thought of about your game. So lots of people are very into coming up with characters and story and, some of the action in the game and some of the level themes and things like that. But like nobody really says to themselves, "Oh man, I'm going to have the best options screen. Like it's going to be sick." You know, that's not what people get really excited about when they start making video games. But a good game design document will make you think of those things, the things that you never really thought about, and when you kind of define everything that goes into your game. Transformational Framework will do the same thing. It's going to make you think about, like, it's very easy for new game designers in transformational settings to focus on brainstorming the things that they think is going to be that they think are going to be really cool about their games, the gameplay, the setting, the story, the different modes and game mechanics. But they need to start thinking about what it is you're trying to say about the real world, who you're trying to say it to, why those people need it said to them, and what kind of resources are important to find to actually like get this information. And that's what it's going to do for us. So, as with the diagram about where the game ideas come from, the Transformational Framework puts player experience at the center. That's the other reason I like it. Unlike that first diagram, though, that I showed where I had like the different places games come from, players are central to nearly all of the nodes in the framework. So where the nodes in my diagram were kind of like things that often are cited for their own sake. Like people will be like, I have a new piece of technology, I want to make a game. I have this mission, I want to make a game. And again, all good things, but if you don't put player experience in the center of those, it can fall apart. What I really like about the framework is that all of these nodes are about player experience, because they are where you can get away with, if you had to, a technical novelty in a game. And I can certainly, off camera, cite examples of games that were not that great, but, that might have had some technical novelty and were designed to be played like maybe very quickly. And that was enough for that game. So, it's one of the types of things where in transformational games, you really don't have that leeway. Your transformational game doesn't work if it doesn't create transformation. So we have to think about everything from the user experience point of view. So it's kind of like, advanced game design, advanced user-centric game design in that way. So each node is largely derived from factors in the user's life, the user being your player, problems that could be addressed by the game, challenges in their lives that stop their development, and how their transformations will be assessed, and so on. So game designer and head of the USC game design program, Tracy Fullerton, has this to say in the first chapter of her book, The Game Design Workshop, that if you take my game prototyping class, is one of your textbooks. I think it's something worth remembering when you make any game, but especially games made to serve users in their real lives. The role of the game designer is, first and foremost, to be an advocate for the player. The game designer must look at the world of games through the player's eyes. So, the way we'll do this is I'm going to look at each of the questions from the Transformational Framework and outline like how each one breaks down. And this will help us see like how we are using game design to be advocates for the player. Now, the book has more information, like I said, so please still read the book. This is not a replacement for reading the book, but like I said, it's more of a guided tour. So the first question presented by the book is, why is it important for your game to transform its players? And that gets to its high-level purpose. So I want to highlight some of the points that the book brings up. I've talked about the idea before when we talk about games that do poorly with second order design problem of, using shallow mechanics to communicate a message on a very surface level with little meaningful play. So games can't be all message. They have to take other factors into account, such as the user experience and how effective their interactivity creates expression. So why is this important? You and your team, first of all, need to agree on your game's mission or purpose to align members of your game team. That's from a team development standpoint, that's really important because this is going to be your sort of North Star guiding light. It's something that you and your team should agree upon, like you all want a game that brings about some sort of change in the world. So you should focus on the mission, but don't focus on the game as a product or a piece of software. So again, you're going to be building this for people and for a mission. You're not focusing on this necessarily always as commercial, because many serious games, many transformational games are not even necessarily commercial. They can be, but the mission should be something that is forefront in your mind, because you want to make sure that you're not just making a cool game. You should make a cool game, but you also do need to make it about a mission. And I realized that this slide is me kind of flipping on everything that I just said, where it's like, oh, it can't just be about the mission. It has to be a good game. But you need both. That mission needs to exist for it to be. I mean, you can make a great game that's kind of light on mission. It's a great game, but, it won't serve your client eventually. So let's say you make a great game, but your client wanted something different, then you failed your client. Likewise, if you're in this class, you're graded on the way your game fulfills a mission. It's not going to go away if your video game's not great. So you can make a great game, but if it doesn't fulfill a mission, then you're not going to get a good grade in the class. So make sure that the mission is in there. So make your purpose memorable, because remember, people are leaving the game with knowledge about the mission. They are not only playing a cool video game, but they will take it with them better if the video game is cool. See how this works? They good game design and good mission work together. So there we go. So what's question 2? So what is the ecosystem which your game must create change? So why does this game need to be here? Well, so this question speaks to audience and context for when your transformational game is played. So unlike a commercial game, you're not only making the game for pure enjoyment or for fulfilling marketing. You're trying to draw a wider there's a design theory called the magic circle. You're trying to draw a wider magic circle of your game, the area that the game affects, than just the game itself. In doing so, though, you need to think not only about who the game is for, but also where the game is played, at what time, and factors of how it's played. Playing a game at home, for example, is very different from playing an educational game in a classroom during a class period. In one mode, at home, you might be playing recreationally, trying to blow off some steam after a hard day of work or at school. Where in the other mode, you might play in short bursts with the discussion peppered throughout. So if you're playing in a classroom and the game is informing some of your lecture or course content, then you're probably playing in such a way that you're not going to sit down and consume the game all in one go. You're probably going to come in and out of the play experience. That's going to require the game to be in a certain form. And you can't really say, well, I'm just going to design my game and then the teacher is going to figure it out. No, you have to design it to be used by the teacher. So maybe the game is on a tablet or a lab computer instead of a console or a gaming rig. Think about that one. That comes with certain performance issues. But that also comes with, again, certain user experience issues that you need to think about. The context is a distinct part of the gaming experience. And of course, it has to appeal to the audience. It can't just be like, again, on that flip side, it's got to be good game design. It has to appeal to the audience because the audience isn't going to want to actually play it if it's a crappy game. That's actually one funny thing about having kids. A lot of stuff, especially coming out of the pandemic times. Again, I'm recording this in the fall of 2022. Or at least coming out of this most severe part of the pandemic times. A lot of the online learning stuff that my daughter had to do was online games that were educational. And some of them were just really poorly constructed as games, and she picked up on that. Partially because her dad's a game design professor, but also partially because she's just like, this game kind of stinks and I don't really want to play it. And the way it presents the information is bad. So she didn't get the most out of it. She's doing fine at school and everything, but the games were bad. So, kids pick up on that, if you're making educational games. But the player is going to pick up on that in general, no matter if you're making a game for, I'm kind of hitting, educational games for kids kind of hard here, but like, your VR training simulation for construction workers and workplace safety. If the game stinks, then they're going to tune out and then they're not going to learn it and then somebody could get hurt. So think about that. The gameplay helps people be changed by, gameplay, mission, work together, and making sure that they are playing in a context where they're actually going to be engaged and, you're going to be able to get the most out of the experience is really important too. Some things to think about in terms of audience and context. So think about what state is your audience coming into the game. There's a term called the transformational gap. What knowledge or action is between your audience and your goals for them or their goals for themselves. So like, why don't they know what is it that's keeping them from knowing the information your game is imparting? Why? Like that's often most important because your game's not just supposed to teach them the good behavior. Your game is supposed to address the transformational gap. The example that I'm fond of using in the classroom is, if you're making a game for people who eat too much McDonald's, and have like health problems related to eating too much McDonald's, the game you shouldn't just jump into making is eat fruits and vegetables, because they might know that. They probably know that, but they might say, well, where am I supposed to get the fruits and vegetables? And if you didn't look hard enough at your audience and you just assumed, well, they just need to be told to eat fruits and vegetables, you've spent a year and like thousands and tens of thousands of dollars probably, because the budgets for these aren't huge. Maybe, luckily, if you're lucky, hundreds of thousands of dollars. That'd be nice. To make a piece of interactive software that, let's assume it's a video game, could be a board game, but you're still making a game where like, it doesn't serve the audience because you didn't go and talk to them, or you didn't go research enough about your audience to know, oh, they actually live in a food desert. So that transformation gap, the game needs to address the transformation gap, not just kind of like wag its finger at the player. You need to ask, do they want to be transformed, and what can increase their transformational motivation? And then other things to think about your players. Think about what's their socioeconomic status, education, behavior, economics, etc. Technology or physical access to technology. Can they reach or physically operate your game? Cultural norms. Is anything in your game offensive to a player's culture or background? Related content. Is your game supporting a class? So, and this goes to context. Are they playing your game in a library? Are they playing your game at home? Or are they playing a game in a classroom where maybe the game needs to, again, be able to start and stop to be integrated into some sort of discussion. Social connections, who are your players' social networks, and then other formalized structure. Again, is it in school? Is it part of a community activity? All these things are going to affect your mechanics. They're going to affect the technology your game is on. Are they on mobile? Are they on car? Is it mobile, VR? Are you talking to people who have lots of technology, or are you talking to people who maybe have difficulty using or accessing technology? And in that case, you need to take like a card game with you or something like that. Is it a game that is going to be played in a 45-minute workshop session? And is it worth having a piece of technology that you have to install on your mobile device and learn how to operate in that time? Or are you going to get much more efficiency in gameplay by having it be, again, a card game or something, more approachable? Again, is the age group of your audience going to be the people that would look at a video game, a 3D video game, and say, oh, I don't play those? Or is it going to be somebody who, like, yeah, if it looks kind of like Monopoly or looks kind of like, Sorry or Clue or whatever, are they going to be more in tune with that? So these are all things you need to think about. That's not just, hey, let's make a cool video game. The other thing to know is that for projects like these, your audience may not be directly your players. They may extend beyond the players of the games themselves. So sometimes this is actually who you're selling your games to. So like, if let's go to educational games again, like, let's say elementary school education games, the players are going to be the kids, right? And they might, be playing a math game or a reading game. But the kids are probably not the ones buying the game. It's probably their parents who are buying the game. Or maybe, it's not an educational game at all. Maybe it is that one of my group of my former students have a studio where they do their main like driver of revenue is training simulations for firefighters. So those games are made for like a client. So they are working with fire departments to create the simulation. Sometimes it's that there's a client or some other funding agency, people who want a game that supports their research. So again, sometimes you'll be approached by academics that say, we think games could help reduce, I've done games that help reduce recidivism in the corrections system. And we were approached by a group of academics on a college campus. So, and then back to education, it might be school districts or teachers who want to install a game in their classroom or have a game for their classroom. So it may not, the audience may not just be the players. Like I bought a game, again, I'm trying not to date this as much as I can so that people can like watch it in the future. But I bought a game last week and I'm going to play it. And it's like, okay, cool. I am the audience for that. The chain goes much broader, or can go much broader, with transformational games because you might be dealing with teachers and parents and funders and clients and people who are not actually going to be playing it. So in some models, these people buy or fund, then give the game to the actual players to educate them or collect data for their research from the play of the game. So try to build a profile of a typical game player you should do that for any game you make, but it's especially important here to try to understand the factors that may affect them. And again, all those other factors I talked about. When you do that, you start to reveal lots of things about your game. Not things just about the players, but things about what the game should be. And if you think about those factors, you're going to have so much information about what your game needs to do before you even get to game mechanics. Even get to game brainstorming. Certainly before you get to like picking a piece of technology, that's like the last thing you need to really do. Um, so you'll learn things like, should it be digital or non-digital? How long should it be? What kind of graphics should it have? Should it have a fantasy to it? Should it be straightforward and like, no, it needs to look exactly like the construction site or the, diagnostic room that they're going to be working in. Those are things that this process will help you understand. It's vital to this type of design. So question 3 is, how should players, these are going to go faster now because we got through that one. That was like kind of the big one, a big one. How should players be different after playing your game? So transformational game, how does it transform the player? Because again, we're not dealing with the kind of games that are going to be just like, oh, cool, I had a great time playing this game with my friends online, and now I'm relaxed, and now I'm able to go, I don't know, start my week or end my week or whatever. Get to my doing the dishes because I've gotten some moments of relaxation with Call of Duty or something like that. The player walks away with something like that. The player walks away with something even more than that. Like relaxation and blowing off steam in a game can be good, but it's not exactly like the explicit type of transformation that we are doing. We are doing something, a lot bigger. So basically, what observable effects come out of your game? So one way to think of these is with learning objectives, which are quite literally the learning goals that a teacher sets out at the beginning of classes or lessons. In this class, you have them in the beginning of your syllabi. And they're often kind of ignored, not from like a pedagogical standpoint, pedagogy meaning teaching method, but they're ignored as like, okay, we got to get through reading this syllabus, so just read these goals. But they actually are things that we have to prove. We have to set for the classes and then prove that we actually accomplish them. So they are actually like the driver of your classes. But you're basically also creating a set of learning goals when you make a transformational game. And really, you should be doing this for every game you make. Richard Lamarchand in your textbook, Playful Production Process, talks about this at the beginning of the book. It's not learning goals, but it's experience goals. So these come hand in hand. Again, it's that good gameplay meeting good mission. They come hand in hand and they form a really strong union to create like powerful transformational experiences. So basically this comes down to, what are the things that players should take from your game? So think about that. Again, learning objectives should be goals. So you should have experience objectives for good gameplay. But you should also have learning objectives, goals for education from your game based on a structure called Bloom's taxonomy, or skills that affect learning. So again, all of your classes have these on the first page of the syllabus. We're supposed to. So in the case of a transformational game, that actually might be beyond even just like learning objectives. So it might be, there might be learning objectives so that the game is designed to teach you this about math. But it may be behavior change. It's designed to have you do this in your garden so that you can support more wildlife in your garden. Or emotional skills. Maybe it's a game that teaches you the way to resolve conflict in the workplace, or a game that makes you have empathy for a particular group. Those can also be goals. So think about those. Again, this is where you want to dive further into the textbook, but think about those goals in your game. That can help you create a better game. I also like this graphic from the book. When you write down your transformations, and when you document these things in your own project, so basically, again, come up with a list of transformational goals for your project at the beginning of the project. You should center them on how the player will transform because of your game. Make them reasonable. You won't fix the problem itself, probably. Your game will not solve climate change. But it can educate some people about climate change, so hopefully they can come up with solutions or contribute to solutions to climate change. But you may start, your goal is to start conversations and to get people to think further. You should always frame your final goals against the initial state of players coming into your game. Again, when they come to your game and when they leave your game, there should be a measurable difference. And we'll get into how that's measured in a little bit. So the next question for you is to ask yourself why your players even need a game-based intervention. Why? Why even do this? So barriers are the reasons you need to make a game in the first place. They are the core of whatever problem you're trying to solve. Now, we talked about this a little bit. And again, here's this, like, that supermarket example. So again, take, for example, health issues caused by people eating too much fast food. I've picked on McDonald's a lot. Let's say Burger King. You know, they've eaten too many Whoppers. So your first plan is to make a game that promotes eating healthy fruits and vegetables like those found at a grocery store. Aha! I will solve health problems in this community by being like, eat your fruits and veggies. And there are people that would just like make the game and then put it out, and that's it. But the problem is when you do something like that, you may not actually be solving the person's problem. And, you know, I've gone over this ad nauseum, but, you know, here's the slide for it. You know, again, this is why research is important. Read studies about, you know, about, you know, maybe the type of area or population you're working with. Or, frankly, talk to the people you're trying to help. That's the biggest one. Talk to people or community members or community, you know, organizations. Again, often in the real world version of this kind of game design, a community group will come to you to hire you to do this. But, you know, for the purposes of a class like this where you are picking your own topic to address, it's important to remind folks to like make sure that you actually do the right kind of research. Because if you're not doing the right kind of research, then, you know, you are probably going to you're probably going to make a game that won't work because they'll, you know, the community members might see the game and they might be like, well, duh, and then not play it, and then they won't learn anything, and then they won't transform, which means that you've utterly failed at your core mission. So maybe in your research, again, if you talk to people, you'll find the community you're trying to affect knows about a healthy diet, but maybe they're in what's called a food desert, which describes communities where residents lack cars or access to grocery store within a mile of their houses. So again, make sure you're addressing the right problem with your game. In a game design context, finding information like this could help you come up with more impactful design ideas. You know, maybe instead of talking about what foods to eat, your game is actually a game that teaches players how to set up and maintain an urban farm. That could be, you know, an alternative in this kind of case example on how to address the problem based on your actual research and understanding of the group you're trying to help. So identify gaps in support. Where are people not being supported? You know, and there's been a lot of discussion about this kind of thing in the last few years. You know, in the political sphere, why do you see certain political things happening? What is it about groups of people where, you know, there is a lack of support, where, you know, folks are feeling that it is addressed by, you know, particular groups. If particular groups are espousing things that are not good in one way or another. You kind of see that happen. You see this play out in big stages, and it will play out in your game design. Barriers are also catalysts for game ideas. Again, going back to the food desert idea, if you do enough research and you realize, wait, this is the problem, this is the gap that this group of people is having, not that they don't know about fruits and vegetables and how awesome that they are, but that they can't access them, Now you've got core mechanics in your game. You know, the core mechanics of like doing urban farming are there it is. That urban farming, that's your core gameplay. And you need to figure out like, okay, now how do I turn it into a game experience? But there you go. That's a driver of design. So here are some common barriers. Some of them are personal or emotional. Some come from cultural factors. Will you be seen differently in your community if you just have if you have a transformational attitude? So like there are communities where if you act in a certain way, you will be seen as acting like not a member of the community. Is that something that holds people back from doing the transformational things that will solve problems? Others may just be knowledge. The person may have bad information or no information at all about what you're trying to teach them. These are especially common in remote or underrepresented communities. Research is especially key in this step because part of dealing with very sensitive areas like these barriers is that you never want to make assumptions that end up turning off at best. So like at best, you might turn people off. At worst, you might actively offend your audience. This comes down to like, you don't want to talk down to your audience through your game. You want to make sure it is something that the audience doesn't feel like your game is wagging a finger at them. So talk to members of the community, find sources, read articles, and do all the research work. Don't just kind of like make it up and think, yeah, I know enough. No, you've got to put in the work on research. You may not fix every barrier with your game. No game is perfect. Your game should be part of a broader conversation and social system. It should not just be the one solution. Question 5. What is essential to include in the game to transform your players? So ask yourself why the players even need a game-based intervention. So here's a quote from one of my architecture professors, Matthew Geis. He said, my favorite thing about being an architect is that if I'm doing, for example, a hospital project, I get to learn about the doctors and what they do during their day and how to make it easier. This is a paraphrase. I did not write this down when he said it, but this is more or less what he said when we had one of our thesis meetings. So when I'm thinking about design, I think often about this quote. He describes how research into the needs of the user and the needs of the project not only help him design, in his case, a building, but taught him things about fields he would not have necessarily learned about on his own. I think this is one of the coolest parts of game design in general, but also about game design in this space, is that you are learning about basically what other people do. And that can give you a lot of really great perspective on the world. So that's why domain concepts are about. So domain concepts are basically like, if you are dealing in these other areas, again, urban farming, environmentalism, if you're dealing in, healthcare, construction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what are things in those fields that are best practices or important pieces of knowledge that your game should impart, but that you get to learn about. You shouldn't be doing this only with intuition. You shouldn't be doing this only with what you think is common sense, because it's probably not. You shouldn't be doing this all with game design. It's not all on you, which is good. It shouldn't, your job is to make a game and do what game making entails. Your job is to make good gameplay. Your job is to operate the dumb computer things that we have to operate to make games. Because, lots of game things, even tabletop game things, are made on a computer. That's our job. We have to rely on the expertise of other people to help us understand enough to make a good game that is for the client or the group being transformed. So we go to experts and we use their domain concept. So domain concepts are more or less our game's subject matter, but they may also be knowledge or best practices of the field you're making the game about. So again, that thing about doctors, you know, in you have my professor, when he worked on a hospital design, had to learn about what spaces should be in proximity to one another so that you can make the most effective emergency room or something like that. That is not going to come from like, I think this makes sense. No, you ask somebody, you look it up, you talk to the client, you talk to people who are you're trying to help with your building design, or in this case, your game design. So that's the kind of thing that, again, you need to rely on domain concepts, the concepts from the outside domain, to assist your game design. So this is the research that you're doing to build your papers. It's concepts that can become game mechanics. So this is another catalyst for design. Now, be careful though, because when you're doing papers, it's very easy to get like tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of concepts, and then think like, my game has to have all these things. That's not true. If you have too many concepts, you might affect your game's scope. You might overscope your game by trying to put every concept into the game. So part of this, and part of how the semester is built, is that you really only have enough time to do probably one or two concepts. And that's okay. Sometimes transformational games really only address like a small part of an overall issue. But that, again, the part of the issue is something like, maybe it's the one that most affects the user's transformation gap. And in so doing is a really useful part of a broader system of discussion and support that then will like help somebody transform. So that's really an important thing to think about. So again, I'm also going to refer you to the book because there are different types of domain concepts, but they're listed in the book, so go read the book. Again, another catalyst design. Number of complexity of concepts equals scope of the game, so be careful. Yeah, if there's too much to think about in your game and too much to decipher and to learn and to cram, it might also make unhappy players. So again, try to pick the ones most impactful to focus on, and the one that will help best overcome the player's transformation or knowledge gaps. And I'm going to switch myself over here so that you can read that last point. Question 6, I think. Here we go. Cool. Who knows what you don't know that you don't know? This is also really important because, okay, so domain concepts, great. Where do you find domain concepts? Well, we've talked about some of this. You find it in a library, or in research databases, or in scholarly papers about the topic that you're trying to address. Or, but that's hard, and that's work, and that you might miss something and get it wrong because you're not the expert in that. You're the expert in game design. Well, guess what? When you have a job to do, go to the people who are good at that job. Don't always try to do the job yourself. So you go to the experts. So first things first, your job, game designer, in this process is to learn a bit about the subject area. But really, again, I said it already, to be an expert on game design and production and making good gameplay experiences. And like I said, pressing the right buttons in the right interfaces so you can do the technical stuff when it's time to do the technical stuff, right? That's our job. Our job is not to become molecular biologists, epidemiologists, environmental scientists. That's what those people's jobs are. Nor should you let anyone try to make you an expert on those things, because your job is not to be that. And that's okay. So when I've worked with clients, I usually tell them something to the effect of, you're the writer on this. Meaning that they might not literally be the writer. And frankly, you don't want to let the client into the game design sometimes, because that creates the opposite problem where they're trying to be like, I have this idea for gameplay, and you're like, oh no. Because again, they may not understand game scope. They may not understand game technology or what it means to have like a realistic character or something to that effect. That's okay. If you have somebody who kind of like emails you and has a ton of game ideas, that probably just means they think this is really cool and are excited. I've had those clients. It's actually kind of amazing. But, you know, it's reasonable to kind of say, like, look, this is what I need from you. And I always, again, kind of frame that as you're the writer, but I explain that by that, I mean that they're the ones who give us domain concept, verbiage, stats, data, anything relevant that they want communicated. So it's almost like, you know, I just said, focus on domain concepts that are going to be the most important for identifying the transformational gap. Well, if you have a client or you're talking to somebody, so again, in this class, you don't have clients, but again, I invite you to go find members of the community who may, you know, exchange some emails with, things like that. They can often tell you what the transformational gap is, really tell you more about the people that you're hoping to transform, and they can tell you what the most impactful domain concepts for those people might be, or at least, you know, give you a leg up on figuring out which ones to address. Okay, so yeah, basically like rely on these people. For this course, you're not working with a client, so what do? This is where you find resources like papers, journal articles, previous games, talks, and so on. But how do you select them and know someone who's worked in this area versus somebody who just like spouts off junk about it and then, you know, maybe has a cell phone captured at a Hardee's or something? I don't know. First, you want to learn to recognize someone's place in a field. Do they carry credibility? Are they publishing in this area? But are those publications vetted by other people in the area? That's called peer review. And what it means is that you have a backstop of people saying, this is legit. So that's why I focus heavily on scholarly stuff, because it's really important to make sure that like scholarly systems exist not only to make students' lives miserable. They don't exist to make students' lives. Students usually think the scholarly publication or citation system is like there to make their work harder and lives miserable. It's not. It's there so that knowledge has credibility and knowledge is coming from a proven place. Because if it's not coming from a proven place, it's useless. So that's what all this exists for. So, and then in addition to that, you know, when I write a paper, I can't just say whatever I want. I have to cite it. And then usually that is when you know, if you think turning in a paper for a teacher is scary, think about turning in a paper to like 3 anonymous reviewers and like who will then pick apart your arguments. And then, you know, again, in our circles, you often hear about reviewer 2, who's kind of this like negative phantom who like will just give you the most scathing review, sometimes even criticizing you for not writing about a thing that they would have wanted you to write about instead, and criticizing your paper because it's not another paper. You know, if that sounds stressful, it is, but at the same time, you know, if you get accepted by these people, then that means you did it and your ideas are valid, and, you know, that they pass muster and should be consumed by other people. You know, it's not just like some crank tweeting or, you know, putting something on a blog. Though we do that sometimes too. But you know what I mean. So this is why you go to people with expertise. Let's see. Is this a person with good perspective? Are they doing well-structured research? Are they following good research practices? Are they involved in the subject matter firsthand, or are they just kind of like spouting off nonsense because they've got an impression of this? You do hear this a lot in the gaming community. This is what happens anytime. Okay, so this is really, really, really going to date the thing, but think about the like. I am recording this like the day after there was a leak of GTA 6, right? And a lot of gamers saw the imagery in that and were like, "Oh, that looks terrible. What? This graphics suck. Is this like an old version of GTA 4?" No, they don't know what they're talking about because they've never made a video game. They don't know what it takes. Like when the good graphics are added, they don't know when the final part of that process goes. Um, you know, it's like the same thing when people make those like speed level design videos. That's not level design. A lot of those people aren't level designers. They might have like learned how to press the buttons in Unreal or something, but all they're doing is making like a pretty picture with environment art. So they might be like good of environment art arrangers, but that's not level design. But they don't know that. They don't know what they don't know. Um, and they don't have that firsthand knowledge. So they just kind of go online and like make content and put out opinions. Um, and that's the thing. You need to find the people with the firsthand knowledge. So like as people who are interested in game making, it's like you go to the people who have actually made games before to tell you like, hey, is this speed level design video I found worthwhile? No. But it's like you come to people like us who will tell you whether or not they are. Because we've actually done this professionally for money before, and have done stuff in the industry. So how do you find these people with references? First start off with what's in front of you. Internet sources, news articles, be careful. Go to sources more like on your NPRs, your Associated Presses, your Reuters. Stay away from like cable news sources and things like that. Just because there could be like bias. Stay away from editorials. Editorials are mean opinion pieces, things like that. So you want to stay with like, kind of generally, again, peer-reviewed sources. The other thing to see is like, are news sources, if you see something in the news, cross-check it, meaning like go see if other sites are reporting on it. If you know that like 3 or 4 news sites are reporting on it, it's probably a real story. And again, be careful with what those news sources are. If it's all like ones that are known to be aligned with one political mindset, they might all feed off each other. But if you don't see it on other places more widely, then it's probably not really news. So you got to be careful with news sources even nowadays. So who's being cited? Who's being asked for their opinion? Do you know anybody? Another thing to think about. So do you know anybody aside from the news thing? Ask yourself if you know anybody majoring or working in these areas. Maybe they can point you in the right direction. Are there other schools or universities doing work in these areas? Are there other schools within Kent State doing work in these areas? You could reach out to another professor in another area about this topic that you're doing your game on. And then think about, are there people working in this area in your community organizations, schools, hospitals, advocacy organizations, etc. Talk to outside people. Don't just kind of be like, yeah, I'm making my game about the environment. Yo, be good to the environment. That's my paper. All right, let's make a shooter where you shoot litter into the trash. No. You shoot like magic plant energy at garbage monsters or something. That's not a transformational game. That's you trying to hustle me and me giving you a bad grade. So, actually do the research on this. So again, I'm using turn center on you as undergraduate students, but this same thing applies in the real world. Going down a rabbit hole of context and information via networking is really vital to actually making this type of game. Whew, this part's a long one. And someday you may even be seeking these people, but in a very real capacity, where you may find yourself in a position to like get these people actually involved in your project. Is what this slide's about. So like, now you might be working with somebody on kind of like hey, I'm a student and I really would like your thoughts on this project I'm doing for a class. It may not go beyond that. That might be pretty cool. Like, you think about, what if you did reach out to one of these people and they said, that's amazing. Can we show it at our community event? And then you actually like, your game is played by the core audience and then it helps people. Like, that'd be pretty cool, right? But later when you're doing this as a professional, what you might have happen is that you can be in a position, whether you have money or clout or experience, to do so. You might actually like bring one of these experts in on your team. It usually is because you have money. That's pretty much the only way you can actually make this happen. So yeah, like you might actually bring somebody on as like a consultant or a reviewer, and a on-team advisor, or maybe they do actually join your team as like one of the planners of the project. That could be pretty cool too. Again, these are not client people. That's a different relationship. This is like somebody who's on your team. And then expert resources, learn to talk to people who are not in games. This is something every game designer should do. Everybody has to do this. So learn to talk to people not in games. How do you do that? First of all, show, not tell. As game designers, we get very stuck in working on the back end. And we know that like if you're kind of working on your script, the thing that you're going to be doing like lots of scripting in and stuff like that, that's progress. But like the player is not really going to understand that that's progress until you show visually, like right now on a game project we have in our game the ability to have dialogue. But like it's still being worked on. But it's one thing for me to be like, hey, we have this feature. It's another thing for me to make a video, like create a little scene where the character walks up to a character and talks to them and then put that out on Twitter. That's a much better way to demonstrate that we have this. So show, not tell. Always lead with the visual. Don't just say we've been doing back-end work. The downside of that is when you have a long period of back-end work, which is work, you need to craft something that you can then say, and here it is. So sometimes it's a little extra work. Sometimes it distracts from the actual, like, the hard part, to make like a nice visually pleasing demo thing that you can be like, and here's our progress. But having that visual demo that is your progress is going to make people feel better about the progress than if it's kind of like a bunch of parts in the background. Again, having some concrete thing to show. Don't use jargon. This is a very jargon heavy and as a result often perceived as very exclusionary field, both from like a consumer gamer perspective. So gamers can feel like a very exclusionary group, which is also not helped by the fact that gamers are often a very exclusionary group. There were a few within living memory very bad instance. I mean, it's a pervasive problem all the time, not just when it's a newsworthy event too. But part of that we can mitigate is don't use jargon. Watch out for jargon. Don't, even something as like, you might say something like, an NPC. You might just like blurt out NPC someday. Does your grandmother know what an NPC is? Does your great uncle know what an RPG is? He might. He might be thinking it's a rocket propelled grenade. You know what I mean? Like, always make sure that you do what basically you have to do in good paper writing practice. Like spell the thing out and be like, oh yeah, we have this thing called role playing games. It's a game where you do this, and we sometimes call it an RPG. Don't just blurt gamer talk at a client, but take those practices and then actually like embody it in your day to day work, and you'll be like a better member of your broader community. Be transparent with your approach. Don't just like keep it mysterious. It's okay to be like, hey, this is on the back end, but we'll add the nice visuals later. You know, uh, if you're demonstrating how that works, they might still make somebody feel better. Be respectful of their field's approaches and norms. This is going to happen when you're dealing with a client where maybe their field is about something that doesn't necessarily translate to good gameplay. And I have a lecture all about an instance where that happened to me, where like maybe theirs is not about teaching, it's more about measuring, but gameplay is often about teaching. So there was kind of like a butting of heads. You have to come to an agreement and be respectful of each other so that you can kind of reach a good result you're happy with. And then again, they're not game designers. Don't ask them to design for you. That often ends up in like bad scope things. So yeah. And then also often listen to really just don't be a jerk to your clients. This is the way you got to talk to them. Question 7, what can you learn from what others have done? I know this is a long one, but this is a complex lecture. So a few questions. Would you become a chef without learning how to taste and appreciate good food? Would you become an architect without seeing buildings or the arts of different cultures, learning how to read them? Could you do this without understanding materials and what they do and don't do structurally? Of course not. So you probably don't want to make a transformational game, or any game for that matter, without looking at previous works in the field, commercial and transformational, whether or not they've dealt with the subject matter you're dealing with. So this one's kind of easy. So there's this idea in other fields of design called precedent, which is a common or accepted part of the design. So precedent in other fields is a commonly accepted part of a design process. Basically what it is you look at previous works of a field that may inspire you in some way. Maybe they have an appealing style. Maybe they have maybe they've like literally solved a problem that you're dealing with. Like maybe they've made a game about the environment and you're making a game about the environment and you want to learn about how you might best make your game about the environment. So you look at other environmental games. Or maybe maybe you want to make an environmental game that's a platformer for some reason. So then you look at a bunch of other platform jumping games, to not use jargon, games where a primary mechanic is jumping. And you want to look at other games like in the platformer genre that have like pleasing jump arcs, and to like kind of whittle down like how you want your jump to feel. That's precedent analysis. So, these are inspirations and you certainly reference them, but in solving your own problems, your project's going to become unique, because a lot of people will think that like, but if you only build your games on inspirations from other games, you're just going to make other games. No, I've had a lot of situations in my own indie development life where you start by kind of like making a stew of other game things, inspirations from other games. But then if you implement something just the way it was in like a successful game, people will be like, oh, no, that's not very good. And you'll be like, but Mario Brothers did it. Well, great. It worked in Super Mario Brothers, but it doesn't work in your game. So you got to tweak it into your game's version. And then, uniqueness. So at a lab I used to work at, we used to have this out a lot, whether or not we should refer to a lot of commercial games. On one hand, it was felt that using gamer references excluded designers who were not traditional gamers and who wanted to learn game design. so that they could take it back to organizations they worked with. So basically, we had a lot of people who were not interested in games as a medium, but like games were kind of hot as a thing for transformational purposes at the time. They still are, but like even more so back then. But they kind of like wanted it both ways. They didn't want to be a gamer, but they wanted to use game design. And um, I also worked at a place where like game references were like forbidden by one of the bosses because it was felt that clients would not take us seriously if we like talked about popular games too much. It was weird. So again, this was like started by a person who like it was a game studio started by a person who like hated games. It was weird. But here's my firmly held belief on this. And again, I realize I'm preaching to a choir here, but like hear me out. This is really important because when you are in games and in transformational games, our stock and trade is the game. How do we make good games? Well, we have our good skills with the pressing of the buttons and the things, like that. But you could be capable of making lots of great graphics. Again, it gets to that, speed level design like video challenge where it's like those people are great at pressing the buttons, but like they're not making space. They're not demonstrating how you direct the player's eye. You're not demonstrating how you create different emotions via the organization of like visual and audio elements and gameplay elements within like the space that constitutes a level. So, how do you learn that stuff? Well, you learn it you learn about level design and architecture and stuff like that, but you also like play lots of good games that have good level design. Play games that have bad level design, so you learn what not to do. But basically, you play games. And this is what I always had to tell people who were getting in from that like non-game perspective, is that, well, cool. I respect that you don't want to be a gamer. That's fine. Nobody's asking you to be a gamer if you're not a gamer. But it's not unreasonable to ask somebody who is paying money to learn about game design to like learn the defining works and best practices and be able to like at a basic level identify critical elements of games such that they have an understanding of how to make how to be more effective at the thing that they are purporting to want to learn about. Does that make sense? So we're not judging you for having for your gamer score the amount of trophies on PlayStation or any of that kind of stuff, whether or not you can speed run whatever whatever game you want to speed run. That's not what folks are being asked to do. But we are asking you to do good work. So you must actively engage and be current in the works of your peers, because when you do this, you're a game designer and you're in the game industry. So it's not unreasonable to be a member of the game industry, even if you're also in the biomedical industry or the education industry or some other industry. So you want to keep an eye on the state of things, because learning about what works and what doesn't work is what helps you make better games. And in so doing, make games that actually succeed in transformation. Again, I won projects away from people who didn't understand this and made bad games. They were bad at this. But they knew how to talk about a mission statement. But their games would be they would unironically do the thing that the Stanley Parable has in it in the art game scene. They would make a thing that's really ham-fisted and has like all of its thematic elements on the surface and has like a too simple mechanic and like really within the gameplay didn't explore the nuance of the topic. The nuance of the topic was meant to be given to you by the designer standing next to you talking at you. That's bad game design. And we shouldn't stand for it. I don't stand for it. That's why I ask people like, hey, I don't care if you want to become a gamer, but it's your job to learn about games. And again, I know I'm preaching to a choir, but some of you who may not be in my class may need to hear that. But I will say this to the game designers out there. Don't only learn from games. Because if you only learn from games, if you swing the opposite direction or overcorrect, you're also going to have a limited cultural understanding. So learn from books, learn from film, learn from folklore, learn from history, learn from art, learn from dance, theater, food, beer, wine, architecture, puppets, anything. Expand your cultural horizons, because when you bring cultural horizons from outside of games, this is where those non-gamers were great game designers. They were working with understandings of fields outside of games and bringing them back into games such that even if the game wasn't that great, there was like something eye-catching about it because it had a uniqueness. They may have not stuck the landing, but they might have caught your eye for a second because it was a game about something totally new. So, it goes both ways. You are absolved from being embarrassed by games. And when I was growing up, like D&D was seen as embarrassing. Guess what? You're immune to that now. You can play whatever you want, and you are immune from being embarrassed by it. Unless you play like something socially gross. But like, go LARP. And that's not me picking on LARPs. That just seems to be like the one that people are like, oh, well, LARP is weird. No, you can LARP. You can LARP all the LARPs you want to LARP. For those who don't understand what that is, that's live action role playing. It's like performance art and like D&D style role playing kind of together. It's actually kind of awesome. But that's your job. You get to sample all these things, or at least watch YouTube videos of them. But on the flip side, make your games better by bringing in these outside influences. Don't just reference other video games. That was a long time on one slide. I apologize. This is also a very long lecture. This is probably the longest lecture in the course. Thank you for sticking with it. This should be one of the last, or we're getting close to the end here. One of the things that you need to understand, though, is how will you measure your game's impact? And this goes into forming an assessment plan. So I'm going to make this portion brief, since there is another area where we could probably do a whole lecture on this section. So please read the whole chapter. But the thing I want you to take from this overview of this section is that in planning your game, you should also plan for how you're going to measure and present its effectiveness. Cool, you made a transformational game. How do you know it transformed anybody? Well, you can't just make the game and be like, yeah, I bet it'll be good. No, you can't do that. You have to actually say, and here is data that proves that when people came to our game, they felt one way, and when they left our game, they felt another, or knew some new thing, or some transformation happened. So this helps you figure out whether you did make changes. And it helps you figure out when you're testing your game, does your game work yet? Because, it's one thing to do this like at the end. But, if you made this bad and then it's like any other game design. If you did this poorly and you waited until the very end after you spent all that time on art and music and all that stuff that costs money. Not that you're spending money, but that in the real world costs money. If you spend all that time doing all those production steps and then the transformation part doesn't work, you failed. You didn't do it. So when do you do this? Well, like any other game design, you play test and you make the assessment part of your play testing. So make up an assessment plan that says, here are the questions we're going to ask somebody, probably on something that looks like a play testing questionnaire. before the test and after the test. And if you can find something that will allow you to pinpoint, when we played this game with 100 people, 75% of those people said that they felt differently about environmental conservation after playing our game. This, 100 is not a huge sample size. I just did that for like easily being able to grok the number, understand the numbers. But like, that's a statistic. That's data. You can use that. That's better than just being like, yeah, I bet our game will work. Yeah, totally. Yeah, this is going to be great. You see, this is going to be amazing. No. Collect the data and make the plan to collect the data and then collect the data. Because feedback has to be, impact has to be demonstrable. The way you gather this data depends highly on the game and on your purpose. Some games can track progress via in-game assessments. So maybe, it is a learning game and you notice that after, so maybe you have like, the game itself is storing the data. Like, let's say you're making a math game for kids and you notice that like after playing the game for 30 minutes, they start getting math questions right faster, or they get more questions right in the assessments throughout the game. Or on repeated plays, this user has gone through and gotten like these skills right, more often. That's measurable, and that's measured within the game. Again, sometimes if you're making a game about empathy or something not totally data driven, you can do a before and after questionnaire for your game. You sit down and you say like, okay, what do we want the player to what do we want to measure where they are before and where they are after. Again, back to purely education, maybe, yeah, like a kid plays your game and their test scores in an area improve. That's another one that's an external to the game, but still kind of data driven. Like I said, before and after surveys, there's lots of ways you can do this, but yeah, you should be assessing the actual impact of your game. Please don't just be like, yeah, it worked. And then, so really quickly, this week's case study, the Oregon Trail, perhaps the most famous educational game of all time, was designed by Don Rowich, who is not trained as a game designer, but as a teacher. He wanted to design a game to teach his students about the period of Western expansion in the United States, and in 1971, devised a game that would be played by responding to questions of what the player, as a settler, would do next in their journey west. This game originally appeared on teletype computers, meaning that, you would get a little slip of paper printed out that had like, kind of your stats, and then it would say, what do you do next? And you would say, and then you'd type in your response, and then you'd feed that into the computer, and the computer would churn data and then spit out another piece of paper for you to respond to. And then eventually it was ported into like the Apple II and other computers. Home computers became a mainstay in elementary school classrooms. And my own school had Oregon Trail Deluxe, which was an option for what to play after for us, like after we do our Microsoft Excel or Word learning exercises, we could play Oregon Trail if we wanted to. It was awesome. And I know things about Western expansion now as an adult because I played Oregon Trail. So absolutely had transformational impact. So what is the transformation? So like, let's look at this as a transformational game based on the things we talked about today. So what is the transformation? So the transformation was that Rawich wanted was teach kids about Western expansion, audience and context, K-12 kids learning in classrooms, often with some discussion, which is literally what he did it for because he was an elementary school teacher teaching in a classroom on a unit on Western expansion and had some discussion afterward. Player transformations, knowledge acquisition. That's it. It was knowledge acquisition. This is a game for education in this case. I'm going to switch my little window over so you can see the text. Barriers. Traditional teaching of... So what are the barriers on like just learning about Western expansion? Well, traditional teaching of subjects like this is boring often, So like I remember a lot from history classes. I do. I really do. But the people that the teaching that was the most effective was the one where there was something else going on. Like the teacher was kind of an amazing personality or would like talk about certain things as a catchphrase. I still remember Civil War generals because my teacher, Mr. Schilling, would say something like, if you learn nothing else about General McClellan, it's that he was cautious. I know enough about General McClellan that I can say that to you years later in an online lecture, and try to get something towards his cadence when he said it. So yeah, like that was not boring. But I've forgotten a lot of other stuff from classes that were more boring. Maybe it doesn't proper, and then sometimes like these courses don't properly capture complexities and nuance of something as complicated as like surviving on a trail. So you don't really get like a mastery of the topics. Domain concepts. What are some of the domain concepts used to express things in this game? Factual history and teaching procedures. So there is teaching procedures put into how the game fed you information. And that was really important, because like the facts could actually be engaged with through these mechanics that are reflecting like good kinesthetic learning. Expert resources, that he went to history textbooks and was a teacher. Prior works, originally none because he was the first one to do it. But later versions like the deluxe one, which is also one of the reasons that I focus on the deluxe one. I'm pointing to my screen because I have a second screen here. They could kind of riff on resource management sims a little bit. So you get kind of like the engagement of like, oh man, maybe there's like some Sim City to it or some other game that had like popular game mechanics that could be like brought into this classic educational work. So in like a later version. So that's the thing is like these games kind of riffed on each other. And there's like a ping pong effect of like, Oregon Trail does something, and then another game learns from that, does something else, and then Oregon Trail's like, that's cool. Let me kind of do my own version. And then assessment, in-game and class assessments. It's a classroom game. You can like play Oregon Trail and then take a test on the Oregon Trail, and then you can see if your test scores go up on this topic, or if it helps you study for it, or there are lots of things that you could do to assess whether or not this was actually acquired. Again, I know all about the Oregon Trail because I played it as a kid. Assess that. It worked. So, these are things that a really good game will do. And then lastly is, of course, what is your homework that is due next week? Well, your homework that's due next week is the paper draft. In this assignment, you will utilize your outline and the research you've done to write the paper draft. It should be at least 7 pages. Each divide and conquer, each group member take one section of the paper. Please do not, put each person who worked on each section's name on each section. They should hopefully read like one voice. Obviously you should do a pass at that later, but try to keep it sounding like it's the same voice as much as you can. And then I'll look at those and I'll give you feedback. And then after I give you the feedback, hopefully you'll be able to make a really good paper, because we are using these not as like I'm going to grade it based on quality. It's a draft. I want to just see that you have a draft, and then I can give you feedback, and then you'll incorporate that feedback in the final paper, which usually results in a better paper. So, please don't be afraid of this. It is here so that we can have better final papers. That's it. Thank you for sticking around for an hour and a half. This was a big one. It's probably the biggest of the entire class. Lots of stuff here, but I hope you enjoyed it. And I will talk to you later.